When I saw him walking beside her, my chest seized so hard it felt like something tore loose inside me. Because in that heartbeat I understood, he was guiding her. And he wasn't alone. 2 evenings earlier my 6-year-old granddaughter, Emma, had been trotting ahead of me on a narrow game trail near Silverpine Ridge. She laughed, pointed at a hawk, and slipped around a sun-bleached boulder the size of a pickup. I heard her steps for maybe 3 seconds beyond the bend. Then nothing. No cry. No rustle. Just the gulping hush a forest makes when it decides to hide something. I sprinted, lungs ripping, but the trail forked into a mess of elk tracks and shadow. "No, Emma!" I shouted until my throat bled. Dusk fell like wet canvas. By midnight every neighbor with a flashlight was combing the timber. State troopers rolled in at dawn with dogs, drones, and a chopper that slapped the treetops raw. They found footprints that stopped at a dry creek and a single pink hair tie snagged on alder bark, like the woods had sent back a receipt for taking her. 48 hours passed. Frost hardened the ground at night, daytime winds rattled the canopy like bones in a box. Hope thinned. I kept moving because stopping meant picturing her shoes filling with cold water or her voice cracking on my name while coyotes answered. By the second dusk every volunteer looked at me the way people look at a condemned house, sorry, but already half gone. Then, as the sun slid down in smoky orange bands, the tree line on the south slope fluttered. A small figure stepped out, barefoot, hair matted with pine needles, face grime-striped yet calm. Emma. She held her palms open like someone who's learned a secret handshake with the dark. Right beside her padded a wolf. A full, gray patriarch of a beast, broad head, scar down the muzzle, coat peppered silver like old iron filings. He matched her pace exactly, shoulder brushing her hip each time she swayed from fatigue. His ears flicked, but he never looked away from me. I was frozen halfway between a prayer and a roar. The deputies raised rifles. I barked them down so loud my chest burned again. The wolf stopped 10 yards out, set his paws square, and fixed me with eyes the color of river stones turned in moonlight, ancient, steady, measuring. Emma crossed the last stretch alone, fell into my arms, and sobbed once, more in relief for me than for herself. My hands mapped every inch of her, scratches, yes, bruises, yes, but no break, no hypothermia. A miracle wearing dirt like war paint. I looked up. The wolf hadn't moved. He seemed to wait for something, permission, acknowledgement, maybe a promise. Behind him, deeper in the gloom, a second shadow hovered. Taller than a wolf, narrower than a bear. I blinked, and the shape melted into the trunks, silent as mist. The big gray exhaled, turned, and loped after it without a sound. The search crews erupted, cheers mixing with curses and shaky laughter. Someone tried to rationalize, captive wolf escaped a sanctuary, animal imprinted on children, blah blah. I barely heard. My entire mind was the image of that huge gray flank touching my granddaughter like a guardrail made of fur and heartbeat. In the field tent medics wrapped Emma in blankets and peppered her with questions. She answered softly, eyes half closed. He showed me where the water was. Who? The wolf. And who was the lady? A nurse asked before I could. Emma's brow pinched like sunlight hurt. She didn't talk with her mouth, she whispered. She sang without words. The wolf listened too. They chalked it up to stress, hunger, childish imagination. But when they unzipped her parka they found a red ribbon tied around her neck in a loose bow, a ribbon none of us had ever seen. Its ends were frayed like it had been worn long before touching Emma's skin. That night I stood on my porch staring at the timberline, every nerve strung like fence wire. Wind smelled of pitch and distant snow. I kept replaying the gaze the wolf gave me, heavy as a handshake I hadn't returned. I should have thanked him, my mind insisted. I should have bowed. Around 2 a.m. I finally shut my eyes. A thud snapped them open. Outside, under the porch light, sat Emma's missing shoe, clean, laces tucked in neat. Beside it, outlined in dust, was a single paw print big as my spread hand, and another print beside it, unmistakably human, bare, slender, heel deep like someone had leaned back to look at our house one last time. I thought that was the end of it. How wrong I was. The wolf didn't bolt. He stood there, tail low and still, as deputies boxed the clearing with flashlights and radios crackling my granddaughter's name like a broken prayer. His ears flicked at every human shout, yet his gaze never left me, two steady embers floating above the dusk-damp grass. For a moment it felt wrong to move, as if any step might tear some fragile thread stretched between us. Then the gray giant pivoted, slow and deliberate, and padded back into the dark the way a tide withdraws from shore. 1, 2, 3 silent strides and he dissolved among the spruces, taking the second shadow with him. Emma clutched my coat but said nothing. No sobbing now, just an eerie calm, eyes dilated, lips pressed tight as if a single wrong word might scare off whatever courage was still holding her upright. Paramedics hustled her under warming lamps, ran thermometers, draped foil blankets, asked a carousel of questions. Emma stared at their mouths moving and shook her head until one medic finally asked, "Sweetheart, can you tell us anything? Anything at all?" She swallowed and whispered, "He showed me the way home." They leaned closer. "Who did?" "The wolf." She didn't say a wolf. It was the wolf, like a title. I knelt beside the cot, fingers trembling at the loose bough of that red ribbon. "Baby, how did you stay warm out there?" "He came every night," she breathed. "He sat by the fire." "The fire?" a deputy echoed, eyebrow jumping. Emma nodded once, small and solemn. "The fire kept singing, so I knew I wasn't alone." Her voice carried no fairy tale wonder, only simple report, the way someone describes Tuesday's weather. My mind staggered, a 6-year-old alone in 50 degrees, frost on the ground, claiming she spent nights by a campfire, one she could never have built. I smelled her hair, under pine and sweat lay unmistakable camp smoke, deep in the strands like it had woven itself around each follicle. When the doctor lifted her left hand to check capillary refill, she hissed. A thumb-size blister bloomed across her palm, red and new, edges flecked with ash. She must have touched a hot stone, the doctor murmured, but his certainty rang hollow even to him. Back home I carried Emma straight to the bath. Soot spiraled off her skin, rinsing childhood and forest into the same swirling drain. She kept glancing at the fogged window that faced the trees like someone waiting for a signal. When I set her in bed, she latched onto my wrist. "Grandpa?" "Yeah, baby?" She wasn't afraid of the wolf either. A weight punched my ribs. Who wasn't? The lady. She stayed with me while he hunted. Hunted. The word lodged between my teeth. "You saw a woman?" Emma's eyelids fluttered, exhaustion pulled her sentences apart. She had no shoes. Her feet were quiet. A beat of silence. She put this on me. Tiny fingers touched the red bough at her throat. Said red is how wolves remember friends. Then sleep dropped her mid-blink, head tilting like a flower too heavy for its stalk. I sat beside her until the house settled into its midnight creaks. I wanted to believe fatigue had spliced dream into memory, but the smoke tang on my cuffs kept arguing otherwise. At 2:30 I slipped outside with a flashlight and walked to the yard's edge. Wind hissed through cedar boughs. Somewhere an owl traded syllables with the dark. I swept the beam across frost-silvered grass. Near the garden gate lay a circle of charred stones, 4, exactly. They hadn't been there yesterday. Inside the ring rested a small cone of ash still breathing a faint orange core, as though banked carefully to last until morning. My knees threatened to drop. I pressed 2 fingers to the nearest stone, warmth pulsed back, a living heartbeat. Beside the circle, indented in soft loam, were prints, the deep round of a wolf's paw and, inches away, the delicate outline of a bare human foot, toes pointed toward the forest like an arrow. The flashlight trembled in my grip. I'd expected maybe tire tracks from a search crew truck, a child's forgotten mitten, something human. Instead I was staring at proof that the night itself had walked Emma home and paused here long enough to leave its calling card. I stumbled inside, boot soles suddenly clumsy, and poured 2 fingers of whiskey I couldn't taste. My reflection in the window looked back hollow-eyed, mouth working around questions no dictionary covers. Wolves don't tend fires. Wild women don't roam these woods barefoot in November, guarding lost children. And yet a tiny blister, a red ribbon, smoke-scented hair, and a still warm ember said otherwise. Morning dragged in pale and brittle. Emma padded to the kitchen, cheeks pink, hunger wide open. Between spoonfuls of cereal she asked if the wolf had come to say goodbye. I told her I didn't know. Truth was, I wasn't sure who, or what, I hoped to see out there. She finished the last bite, considered, then looked up with eyes too old for 6. Grandpa, she told him it's safe now. Who told him? My voice was gravel. The lady. Emma touched her ribbon again. She said you'd understand soon. A chill threaded my spine. Understand what? That wolves are escorts? That fire sings lullabies to scared kids? That some barefoot guardian roams Silverpine like a ghost mother? I thought last night's footprints, that ember, the blister were the end of the mystery. How wrong I was. I left at first light with nothing but a thermos of coffee, a flask-sized Bible I hadn't cracked in 30 years, and the directions Emma murmured before she fell back asleep: go past the fallen cedar, follow the creek upstream 3 bends, then look for the rock that looks like a sleeping bear. The way she said it, like street names she'd memorized, tightened something under my ribs. 300 yards beyond the property line the ground went from frost-stiff grass to slick river stones. My boots skidded twice, palms slamming rock, but I kept going. After the second bend I almost convinced myself none of it would be there, just an overactive imagination riding shotgun on too little sleep. I was wrong. And the forest made sure I knew it early. A single wolf print, broad pad, for crisp toes, pressed into mud so fresh the edges still leaked water. My breath fogged out in a ragged plume. For a heartbeat I relaxed. Maybe it was all just a wild animal's den, maybe I'd collect nothing but tracks and head home. But the forest wasn't done with me yet. 50 paces later the muddy bank leveled into a glade the size of my living room. Pine needles carpeted the soil like old felt, all except a bare circle 2 feet across, a fire pit choked with white ash and half-charcoal logs arranged in careful teepee fashion. Whoever tended that blaze knew how to keep a slow, smokeless burn. Beside the ashes lay Emma's rag doll, Angie, floppy, nose chewed off by the dog years ago, propped upright against a stone as if waiting for applause after a campfire story. A new red ribbon, twin to the one around Emma's neck, held Angie's yarn hair back from button eyes. My fingers shook when I picked her up, cloth was still warm from last embers. No 6-year-old could have balanced her like that, not in the dark, not after 2 nights lost. I set Angie down and followed the prints fanning out around the pit, small bare feet, M-size, heels light on the earth the way kids tiptoe through midnight. Interlaced with them were deep, narrow impressions, adult, but the stride said barefoot, weight settled square, toes gripping soil for balance. They looped the fire twice, diverged, then met again at the north edge of the clearing. There the prince stopped at a cluster of fist-sized stones laid in the unmistakable shape of a cross. Not a crude kid's X in the dirt, this was precise, 4 dark stones, long ones north-south, shorter east-west, their weather-blackened faces turned upward like pages in a hymnal. Moss scraped away, edges aligned as neatly as any grave marker. I'm not a religious man. But right then I knelt in the center of that stone cross and couldn't draw a breath. My pulse smacked my ears so loud it drowned the wind. Humans didn't do this, at least no human I'd met out here. Yet everything about it screamed kindness, deliberate and fierce. Like someone had left a prayer big enough for the whole woods to hear. When I finally stood, I caught motion at the tree line, a flash of gray fur melting between trunks, too fast to be sure. I raised my hand on instinct, some clumsy salute, just in case those river stone eyes were watching. A crow scolded overhead, and the hush rushed back in. I turned to photograph the prince, but the phone in my pocket was dead though fully charged when I left. Its screen lay black, cold as a river stone. The forest guarding its secrets, I thought, and that chill walked straight up my spine. As I stepped away from the cross, something clicked beneath my heel. I knelt, a smooth shard of glass half buried in pine duff, green, thick, the mouth of an old medicine bottle maybe. Etched in the curved lip were 2 letters, EM, could have stood for anything, yet they echoed my granddaughter's initials like a whisper. I pocketed the shard, it felt heavier than glass should, as if holding memory itself. Heading back downstream I found new tracks overlaying the ones I'd followed in, same wolf pads, but this time another set ran parallel, smaller, lighter, maybe a yearling or a mate. Whatever they were, they hadn't been there minutes ago. The prince veered uphill, deeper into territory thick with deadfall and thorn where even seasoned hikers avoid. Sunlight pinwheeled off ice crystals on the branches, and for a split second I swore I heard humming, soft, wordless, carried on the breeze like wood smoke. I almost followed. God help me, I wanted to see who, or what, waited beyond that wall of spruce. But the memory of Emma sleeping safe under quilts tugged me homeward. I left the glade exactly as I found it, only Angie clenched under my arm, soot smudging my sleeve. Halfway back, a fresh wolf howl rose, a low, deliberate note that curved over the ridge and slid into marrow. Not a hunting call. A farewell. Or maybe an invitation deferred. I thought the doll, the cross, the prince were the whole explanation, that now, finally, the story was finished and mercy had closed its circle. How little I understood. I must have dozed off in the rocker by Emma's bedroom door, because the next sound I knew was her whisper cutting the dark. "Grandpa, he's here." Her voice wasn't frightened, it was almost reverent, like altar light through stained glass. I jolted upright, heart sprinting. The clock read 1:04 a.m. Wind pressed the house till the rafters groaned. "Who's here, baby?" I kept it to a hush so the question wouldn't shatter whatever fragile thing stood outside. "The wolf," she breathed. "He's waiting." I followed her to the window that overlooks the gravel drive. A half-moon poured enough silver to turn the world into charcoal sketches. There he was, sprawled motionless just inside the open gate, paws planted, head high. He wasn't pacing or sniffing, he looked like a sentry who'd met the dawn of time and decided nothing since was worth flinching at. But the hair on my arms rose because behind him, half swallowed by the cedar shadows, loomed something. Taller than any animal that belongs to these woods, too slender for a bear. A vertical hush, as if night itself had pulled upright and grown shoulders. I blinked hard, the shape stayed, silent, watching. Emma pressed her palm to the glass. "She's with him," she whispered, fogging a small halo on the pane. I grabbed the .30-30 from the hall rack more out of habit than intent. The steel felt embarrassing, like bringing a pocketknife to a cathedral. Then I stepped onto the porch, boards creaking under a weight suddenly too mortal. The wolf's eyes snapped to me the way a lighthouse beam snaps to a ship, swift, bright, measured. No growl, no raised hackles. Just recognition. The shadow behind him drifted a fraction, as if shifting its feet, but moonlight refused to climb its form. My chest hammered so loud I expected the cedar boughs to echo it back. I took one step off the porch. The wolf stayed. A second step, gravel shifted under my boot and that was enough. He pivoted, a single fluid motion, and headed for the tree line. The dark figure moved with him, silent as breath turning to frost. 10 paces, 20, gone. The gate rocked on its hinges in the after silence. I crossed the yard in 3 strides, pulse banging at my ribs hard enough to bruise. Nothing ahead but the hiss of wind through fir needles, nothing around but my own steam cutting the moonlight. I swept the flashlight wide, no eye shine, no tracks yet. Then the beam landed on the ground just inside the gate, and my legs stopped obeying. A handprint. Not a child's. Narrow palm, long fingers, pressed deep enough to pool moon-cold water in the creases. The impression was pristine, as if whoever left it had placed a calm, deliberate vow into the earth. Beside it, overlapping slightly, a wolf pad print half again the size of my fist. They touched at the edges like clasped hands. I knelt without thinking. The dirt was warm. I swear on every breath left in me, though the air had teeth of ice, that small hollow radiated heat, faint but real, the way the last ember in a stove glows behind its own ash. My knees sank and suddenly the world shrank to black soil, that print, my blood thudding in my ears. Somewhere overhead an owl hooted twice and fell silent, as if paying respects. I'm not sure how long I stayed crouched, one hand trembling inches above the sign. Long enough for the moon to tilt and pull the shadow of the gate across my boots. Long enough for the heat to fade until it matched the night. When I finally stood, I touched the empty air where the figure had stood and felt nothing but cedar needles drifting. I brushed gravel over both prints, half protection, half apology, then latched the gate. Even the metal felt gentler, as though warned. Inside, Emma had already curled back beneath blankets, peaceful as if she'd merely checked the weather. She cracked one eye when I tucked her in. "Did you see her?" I opened my mouth, closed it, and managed, "I saw enough." Emma smiled, a tired, knowing curve, then whispered, "She said the forest remembers promises." Before I could gather a reply, sleep pulled her under. I poured coffee I didn't need and sat by the window till sunrise. Every rustle of leaves teased at a return that never came. By dawn the yard looked perfectly ordinary again, and for a breath I suspected my nerves had staged the whole midnight procession. Then I noticed filaments of wolf fur caught on the gate latch, silver against the iron, swaying in morning's first breeze. I thought that proof would close the story tight, tuck the night away like a chapter finished. How painfully wrong I was. I found Hank Decker mending a culvert on the service road that skirts Silverpine's West Ridge. Everyone in the valley calls him the Ranger, though he's long retired and half-stooped from 40 winters of chainsaw work. His beard is snow-white, his eyes pond green, and his silence as thick as pitch. If the forest keeps secrets, Hank's the lockbox. He straightened when he saw me, wiped mud on his Carhartts, and waited for words. I hadn't planned any speech, just driven until the truck pointed at the mountains. But the story stampeded out: Emma's disappearance, the wolf escort, the midnight visitor, the handprint that radiated heat. By the time I finished, spruce needles were drifting onto Hank's hat brim like slow applause. He didn't smile at the absurdity. He just nodded, as though I'd recited directions to the post office. "That she-wolf," he said, voice creaky like a barn door, "been round these slopes since before I took the badge. Folks swear she was part dog, part something older. Truth is simpler, she never left the pack." I frowned. "You mean a she-wolf?" "The one I saw was gray, scar on the muzzle." Hank lifted a knotted finger. "Scar from a snare, 1998. I said it myself." Regret tilted his chin. "Was trying to collar her for a study. Broke the wire, ran bleeding, never touched another bait. After that, people stopped calling her Wolf. They called her the widow, lost her mate to hunters, kept roaming with the yearlings. But the figure behind her, that ain't the wolf." Hank picked up his hatchet, motioned for me to follow the rutted path into timber so dense it swallowed daylight in one gulp. "You need to see something." The hike was short but steep, switchbacking through mossy granite and blowdown. 10 minutes in, Hank halted at a white bark aspen easily 4 feet thick. Its trunk was peeled smooth chest-high, and in that pale living canvas someone had carved a relief, a woman standing hip to hip with a massive wolf. Her hair flowed into the wolf's mane so you couldn't tell where human ended and animal began. The knife strokes were old, weather-softened but sure. Lichen flickered in the grooves like gilding. "Carved that in '06, Hank muttered. "But the story's older." He touched the woman's face with the gentleness of prayer. "Name was Eliza May Rutherford. Came here from Montana when the mills dried up. Lived alone in a miner's shack off Cedar Draw. People said she had a way with animals, fed injured fawns, stitched owls' wings. One November she followed a wounded pup into a storm and never came back. Some figured hypothermia. Others figured the pack finished the job." He glanced at me, eyes glinting under the brim. "Except tracks told a stranger tale. Fresh snow for 3 miles, wolf prints alongside her boot prints, then just wolf. Boots were set together neat as church shoes, no drag marks, no blood. Like she stepped out of them and walked on padded feet. The wind hissed through aspen leaves, the carving seemed to breathe. People saw her after that," Hank went on. "Not in daylight, at dawn, at dusk. Always helping something lost, a heifer tangled in barbed wire, a hiker with a busted ankle, a kid who wandered from camp. They come back talking about a lady in buckskin who walked like the wind, a wolf at her side. Rain cleaned the prints before anyone else looked." I swallowed. "Why didn't you ever say?" Hank's laugh was dry cedar cracking. "Tell the sheriff a ghost shepherd's children and see how quick the state pulls your pension." "No," I kept quiet. "Carved this so I'd know I hadn't dreamed her." He pointed at the wolf in the relief. A shallow line cut across its muzzle, matching the scar on my visitor's face. My pulse stumbled. "So the widow's still alive." "Alive's not the word." Hank wiped sawdust that wasn't there. "She's part of the pack, sure, but she ain't flesh the way we measure it. Something carried her across a line and didn't bother closing the gate behind." I told him about Emma's ribbon, the warm ember circle, the barefoot handprint touching the wolf pad. Hank listened like a man clocking rainfall, solemn, unsurprised. "When kids disappear," he said at last, "sometimes they bring Em back. Not every kid, not every time. Only the ones that still believe the forest can talk. Most adults never see more than coyote shadows. You," he tipped his hat toward me, "you caught a glimpse 'cause you were listening hard enough." He dug in his coat pocket and handed me a tarnished brass whistle on a frayed lanyard. "Found this where the widow's mate was shot. Wolves don't heed metal, but stories do. Keep it. If ever the child's taken again, or you find yourself lost, blow once. If the pack answers, follow. And don't look over your shoulder. His eyes held mine. Looking back is for those who doubt. I rolled the whistle in my palm. It was cold, yet a tremor of warmth pulsed from the metal like a hidden heartbeat, same heat I'd felt in that midnight handprint. Why help me? I asked. Hank shrugged. Forrest paid me in secrets. Time I settled the debt. He slung the hatchet over his shoulder, headed down trail but paused. You'll want to bury that doll proper. Not inside a house. They don't keep tokens for long, they loaned them to remind you who watched. He started walking again, voice drifting through the trunks, and if they visit, leave the gate open. Wolves don't like latches. I stayed by the carving till shadows stitched the clearing shut, tracing every gouge with shaking fingers. The woman's eyes, though just hollows in pale bark, seemed to say trust the path you can't explain. I thought Hank's tale, the carving, the whistle would finally tie the night's madness into sense. How desperately naive that hope was. The first snow of December dusted our porch rail like spilled sugar when Emma padded into the kitchen at dawn, clutching a fistful of crayons. She didn't ask for breakfast or cartoons, just spread butcher paper on the floorboards and knelt, forehead furrowed in the hush artists keep with themselves. I poured coffee and sat cross-legged opposite her, guard and witness both. She sketched fast. Thick charcoal gray swoops became a wolf, broad shoulders, and that familiar scar slashing the muzzle. Next came a figure taller than the wolf, drawn in one elegant brown line from crown to bare feet. No face, only a wavering shape where eyes should be, like mist that hadn't decided what to become. Around them she scribbled towering green trunks, layered darker until the forest looked deep enough to swallow light. I swallowed instead. Sweetheart, who's the lady? Emma didn't pause. She doesn't talk with her mouth, she said, coloring a blue shadow in the wolf's eyes. But I heard her song here. She tapped her chest with the crayon and kept drawing. What did it sound like? She considered, then half-hummed a tune, no lyrics, just a snowfall of notes that made my scalp prickle. It wasn't lullaby soft or hymn solemn, it felt older, the way wind sounds when it wipes thoughts clean. My coffee went cold in my hand. Emma outlined two small figures beside the wolf, herself and, to my shock, another child, smaller, scribbled in yellow. Who's that? I asked, voice thinner than I meant. My friend, she answered simply. She was there before me. I stared at the yellow stick figure, stomach dropping like an elevator cut loose. Another child lost? Another one the forest had kept? Did she come home too? Emma's crayon stilled, her shoulders tightened. She couldn't leave. The trees were her house. She resumed shading, as if the statement required no follow-up. At that, a cold knot formed behind my ribs, tighter than any winter wind. What did the lady do while you waited? I managed. She held my hand. Emma lifted her left palm, the one that blistered on the ember stone, and pressed it to her cheek. It felt like Mom's when she brushed my hair. Those words landed heavier than snowfall on cedar boughs, soft yet able to crack limbs. I bit the inside of my cheek so I wouldn't drown in the ache. You weren't scared? Emma shook her head, crayon scratching again. I cried once at first, but the wolf put his head on my lap, she said, drawing a blue teardrop on her paper only to color over it with green. The song made the dark go small. They stayed until the sky turned orange. Then she pointed me toward home. She drew a final detail, a red ribbon looping from the woman's hand to Emma's own stick figure neck. She said red is how wolves remember friends, Emma repeated, voice hushed as church pew creaks. I reached across and touched the paper where the ribbon met the wolf's paw. Heat rose through thin stalk, faint but real, as if the drawing still carried campfire breath. My throat squeezed. "Honey, why do you think she helped you?" Emma met my gaze with solemn, unflickering eyes adults forget how to own. "Because you were looking for me," she said. Sometimes the forest only listens when someone is calling with all their heart. That sentence slammed into me like the stock of a rifle, blunt, unforgettable. It felt too weighted for 6-year-old lungs, yet every syllable rang clear. I had called, yes, yelled myself hoarse, but behind the shouts hid raw pleading I'd whispered into spruce bark, promising any price if Emma were spared. Maybe a listening ear in those shadows had weighed the bargain and answered. She added the last stroke, a tiny white star above the woman's head, then laid the crayon aside, drained by creation. The drawing looked nothing like childish doodles, it felt like testimony etched in wax and breath. I rolled it gently and slid it into a mailing tube for safekeeping, though something inside me warned no vault could keep that story if the forest wanted it back. While I fixed oatmeal, Emma rested her head on the table and murmured, "Grandpa, she's not gone. She's watching the creek today." Then sleep tugged her eyelids shut where she sat, spoon loose in her fist. I tucked her onto the couch under quilts, heart rattling in a cage of ribs. Outside, the creek flashed between pines, nothing more than winter water, slick and harmless. Yet I couldn't shake the image of unseen eyes following its bend, guarding its banks for wanderers. I thought Emma's drawings and memories finally gave shape to the impossible, that understanding would settle the dread like dust after a storm. Once again, I mistook a doorway for a wall. By New Year a storm rolled down from the bitterroots and buried silverpine under 2 clean feet of powder. The world turned hush-white, every stump and fence-post erased so thoroughly it felt like the planet had shaken the Etch-a-Sketch and started fresh. Snow like that keeps most folks by the stove, but I laced up the pock boots, slipped Hank's brass whistle into my pocket, and headed for the ridge where cedar meets granite, the place my gut kept tugging me back to. I told myself the hike was just to take pictures for Emma, who was stuck inside with a head cold and a stack of library books. Truth, I needed to know if the forest still remembered us. If they did. The climb was silent except for the soft whump of each step sinking shin-deep. Half a mile in, a line of tracks materialized on the pristine crust like ink on a blank page. First came the wolf prints, big, round, impossibly clear. They followed the contour of the hillside with purpose, not the nervous weaving of a scavenger but the straight run of something that knows exactly where it's going. Beside them, separated by maybe a hand's width, ran footprints of a barefoot woman, slender, high-arched, toes splayed for balance. No boot tread, no sock fuzz left behind. The thought of skin meeting snow without a flinch made my teeth ache. And then, on the other side of the wolf, a third set, the delicate half-moons of a child's feet, smaller than Emma's, each step light yet certain. 3 travelers moving as one. My breath plumed out in ragged wonder. I followed, afraid to blink. The trio wound through ghost-white firs, dipped into a shallow draw, then climbed toward a scatter of boulders I'd never noticed in summer. Each print remained perfect, undrifted, as though the snow itself had agreed not to fall until the message was read. Hank's words echoed, only the ones who still believe the forest can talk. At the foot of a limestone bluff the tracks converged in a tight crescent and stopped. Ahead yawned a narrow crack in the rock, high as my shoulder and just wide enough for a grown man to squeeze through sideways. Wind funneled out, smelling of wet earth and something older, like the inside of a turned-over log where grubs dream. I crouched, tracing a fingertip over the last wolf print. Even through gloves I swore I felt residual warmth pulsing faintly, the way a candle stub stays warm long after the flame snuffs out. Snowflakes pirouetted down at last, lazy and innocent, quickly softening the crisp edges of the prints. Within minutes they'd vanish. A rational man might mark the spot on GPS, come back with rope and lights. But reason felt thin as tissue under that cold arch of stone. My ears rang with hush, no bird chatter, no branch groan, only heartbeat and wind. I pictured the wolf easing through that fissure, the barefoot guardian gliding after, the small yellow figure child Emma had drawn tiptoeing last, and a lump clogged my throat, part dread, part gratitude. I should have turned away. Instead I stepped closer, hand pressed to the rock like knocking on a locked door. The limestone was warm, no mistake now, warm as a living cheek despite air so frigid my breath crystallized mid-exhale. I jerked back, heart thundering. The warmth faded instantly, as if the stone had exhaled once in greeting, then gone still. Snow thickened, setting gently across the trio's final footprints until only soft mounds remained. A hush deeper than silence settled, the sort that makes your own pulse feel intrusive. I stared at the sealed crack, weirdly certain any word I uttered would be overheard by spirits not keen on conversation. After a long shiver I lifted Hank's whistle, thumb chilled on the brass. One sharp note could summon who knew what, or who. My lips hovered, then drew away. Some doors aren't mine to knock, I decided. Not yet. I took a last long look, unmarred snow, whispering pines, rock asleep again. It felt like the final period at the end of a story already more miraculous than any man deserves. I turned downhill, tracks filling behind me with falling flurries, and thought this must be the end. They've gone for good, back to whatever world lets wolves babysit children and ghosts tend fires. How completely, stubbornly certain I was. And how little that certainty would mean once night fell again. The night my granddaughter vanished, I bargained with every god I don't pray to. You know the rest, a wolf led her out of the timber, a barefoot woman walked in his shadow, and nothing about our world has held the same shape since. But what lingers isn't the rescue, it's the knowing that followed. People keep asking what the woman looked like. Honest answer? I never saw her face. I saw presence, a hush that parted branches without breaking them, warmth in the print of a hand long after the hand was gone. I saw a scarred gray wolf move at her heel the way a good dog heels a shepherd, only the roles felt reversed. He was student, she the elder spirit. Emma says the woman's name is a song wind makes through hollow cedar. I can't pronounce it, neither can Emma, really. But she hums the melody when she draws, and every time she does the house walls feel farther apart, as if leaving space for something larger than us. 3 nights after I found the white tracks ending at the fissure, the whistle Hank Decker gave me began to glow faint amber on the bedside table, no flame, just its own breath of light. I didn't touch it. At dawn the glow was gone, but the brass smelled of pine resin and wood smoke. Since then I keep it in a velvet pouch, the way you'd keep a communion wafer long after Mass. Hank and I hiked out to that limestone crack yesterday. The snow around it stood untouched, but the stone itself was warm again, warm despite air cold enough to bite skin. Hank placed his palm on the rock, closed his eyes, and said only, "They're still listening." Then, softer, "The pack's smaller this year. Makes sense they'd take guardians where they can find them." I asked if he thought the woman had ever been truly human. He shrugged, beard stirring in the wind. Wasn't, maybe both at once. Line between flesh and story's thinner than folks like. I couldn't argue, I'm standing on that line right now. I've tried to dissect it the way a mechanic tears down an engine, facts laid out, logic tightened to torque specs. It doesn't work. The story breathes, every time I pin it to one meaning, it rolls over and shows another stripe of truth. One thing I know, That woman returned my granddaughter with more care than many people give their own blood. She guided a child by starless dark, built a fire a 6-year-old could tend, softened the ground where Emma slept, and then stepped back into myth without asking payment. She did it beside a wolf carrying a scar a man once gave him, and together they turned violence into a vow to protect. If that isn't goodness, I don't know what is. Since that day I live with the knowledge that nature remembers. Goodness doesn't vanish, it migrates, sometimes into places we call impossible. And even in the thickest dark, there are hands, or paws, or songs of wind, that lead us back. I've changed. I leave the gate unlatched now, wolves dislike latches, Hank says. I plant red ribbons in the alder branches at the yard's edge so the pack can remember friends. Sometimes they're gone in the morning, sometimes not. Either way I feel seen. When storms push in, I set a ring of stones at the old fire pit and bank one ember till it glows cherry. Neighbors might call it superstition, I call it reciprocity. Once a week I hike to the limestone crack, place Angie the doll on a flat rock, and brush snow from her button eyes. Each visit the doll sits in a slightly different posture, knees angled, ribbon retied, like a child has whispered secrets to her in the night. I hear how that sounds. I do. But disbelief is a luxury I forfeited the second a wolf entrusted my granddaughter to my arms. A last thought, for anyone who finds themselves on the edge of wonder and fear, listen hard. Call with your whole heart. The forest answers more often than we dare to notice, and its answers arrive in forms that make scientists bite their tongues. But they arrive. If your skin's buzzing right now, if gooseflesh is marching your arms, then you understand. Subscribe. Stick around. No writer here invents these tales, the wild writes them, and we just read aloud. And if you, too, have ever witnessed the impossible, type below, animals remember kindness. I know they do, because I saw it with my own eyes. When I heard the familiar patter of paws outside my window, my breath caught in my throat, because I knew she wasn't alone tonight. I'm 55, a retired mechanical engineer who used to measure his life in deadlines and blueprints. 6 months ago cancer took my wife in a blink, and every plan I'd ever drafted went blank. I packed a duffel, sold the townhouse in St. Paul, and drove north until asphalt turned to gravel and the cell signal died. The cabin I found was half-rotted, no electricity, a roof that sighed in the wind, but it sat on the edge of a pine forest too wide for sorrow to fill. I thought if I kept my hands busy enough, splitting logs, patching leaks, hauling water, I might forget how quiet a house sounds when no one calls your name. The fox showed up in late October, right after the first powdery snow. At dusk I'd hear her paws, soft, deliberate taps on the frozen leaves, then catch a flash of red in the fading light. Out of habit more than kindness I left scraps on the porch, a chicken wing, a strip of bacon, the crust of a sandwich I couldn't finish. She'd snatch the food and vanish before I could blink. I told myself it was nothing, just another mouth in the woods, but her appearances fell into rhythm, the only rhythm my days still had. For 3 weeks she kept her distance, a cautious silhouette on the tree-line. I never stepped outside while she ate, I didn't want to break whatever fragile treaty we'd signed without words. But tonight the air felt different, heavy, expectant, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I just set a chunk of smoked salmon on the porch rail and closed the door when I heard it, a low, ragged panting that didn't match her usual quick sniffs. Then came the eyes, 2 amber coins glowing through the glass, fixed on me instead of the food. I froze mid-step, coffee mug halfway to my lips. She didn't bolt. She didn't even blink. Steam curled from her muzzle, each exhale slower than the last. Something in that stare pressed against my ribs, gentle but insistent, the way my wife used to lay a hand on my chest when I'd worked myself into a corner. I set the mug down, hands trembling harder than I liked, and reached for the door handle. The night slapped me with cold the moment I stepped outside. My boots creaked on the porch boards, yet the fox held her ground. The moon cast enough light to paint the snow silver around her paws. Up close she was smaller than I'd guessed, ribs faintly visible beneath the winter coat, but her eyes, those eyes were impossibly steady. I crouched, palms open. "Easy, girl," I whispered, surprised at how hoarse my voice sounded after a day of silence. She tilted her head, then took one hesitant step forward. Another. The salmon sat forgotten between us, food wasn't why she'd waited. Only when she was an arm's length away did I see the quiver along her flanks, the way her sides ballooned with each labored breath. She was carrying something, pain, fear, maybe both, but she wasn't running from it. She was bringing it to me. In her eyes there was no fear. There was something human. She was asking. And she was trusting me. Wind rattled the empty window frame behind us. I could smell pine sap and wood smoke and a faint animal musk, but beneath it all was the electric scent of urgency, of a moment balanced on the edge of now or never. I didn't move. She closed the last inch herself, nose brushing my fingertips so lightly I wasn't sure contact had happened until heat spread across my skin. Her whiskers trembled. My heart hammered so hard it felt like it belonged to someone else. Then, just as suddenly, she stepped back. One turn of her head toward the dark tree line, a silent invitation I wasn't yet brave enough to accept. With a final glance, she scooped the salmon, trotted to the edge of the clearing, and disappeared. The forest swallowed her as though she'd never been. I stayed kneeling, breath fogging in the moonlight, palms still tingling where her trust had landed. Maybe I'd been alone too long, I told myself. Maybe grief makes miracles out of shadows. But deep inside I knew, nature had already started speaking to me, and tonight was only the first word. The next evening the patter came earlier, sharper, like knuckles on a door. I opened the cabin to a moonless blackness, yet the vixen's silhouette was already trotting backward across the clearing, glancing over her shoulder after every third step. "Show me," I muttered, grabbing the flashlight I kept by the jamb. I followed, boots cracking the ice-crusted snow. 20 yards in, the beam caught her eyes, gold slits reflecting, urging, not warning. She waited until I was close, then slipped ahead again, repeating the pattern deeper and deeper, as if afraid the light might shatter whatever fragile bridge lay between us. Branches clawed my coat. The forest smelled of cedar and cold iron. Each time I lost her, she doubled back, circling my legs, then darted forward once more. My knees ached, lungs burned, but a low thrum, half terror, half wonder, kept me moving. At last she stopped beside a tangle of snow-laden elderberry. Beneath the brittle stems lay a russet lump no bigger than a midden. My flashlight shook as I knelt. The kit's fur was matted with frost, sides pumping in shallow bursts, eyes glued shut with crusted tears. I expected panic when my gloved hand slid under its belly, yet it only whimpered, heat radiating through the leather like a coal too weak to burn. The vixen stood 3 feet away, head low, tail motionless. She made no sound, but her chest heaved in unison with the cubs, as though one set of lungs breathed for them both. Time stretched so thin I heard the blood in my ears. "I can't promise," I whispered. My breath ghosted across the flashlight halo. She blinked once. Nothing else. I peeled off a glove, laid bare fingers on the kit's ribs, feverish and rattling. Logic screamed to leave wild things to wild fates. Grief answered with a louder voice, "Not this time." I tucked the bundle under my coat. I rose, turning back toward the faint glow of the cabin window. Snow squeaked. Behind me came the soft pad 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 of paws. I walked with the kid in my arms, and she followed, like a mother handing her child to a stranger, and believing. Halfway across the clearing she melted into the trees, but I felt her gaze between my shoulder blades until the porch light swallowed me whole. False ending. For a heartbeat I thought that was the last I'd ever see of her, that she'd vanished with the secret burden she'd placed in my hands. But the forest had barely begun its sentence. I hardly slept the first night. The kit's chest kept hitching like a misfiring piston, each sputter threatening to quit for good. I'd fashioned a makeshift incubator from a cardboard shoebox, a wool sock, and 2 hot water bottles rotated hourly. Every 30 minutes I warmed a dab of canned goat milk on the stove, drew it into an old plastic eyedropper, and touched the tip to the kit's cracked lips. Sometimes a thin pink tongue flicked out, sometimes nothing. When a swallow finally wriggled down its throat I cheered out loud, then caught myself and laughed at the silence. Morning leaked through the shutters in a flat gray sheet. I crouched beside the wood stove, palms spread over the cub and the socked-in heat. Whenever its tiny body shivered, I whispered nonsense, torque values, baseball statistics, passages from Walden I half remembered. Words didn't matter, cadence did. It steadied my hands, steadied its heart. Sometime near noon a tremor ran the length of its spine. For a heartbeat I feared convulsions, but then the kit let out a threadbare yip, hoarse, defiant, alive. I could feel the vibration through my fingertips. It was weaker than a cell phone buzz, yet it rattled the loneliness out of the room. I set the dropper aside and found myself talking to the pine rafters. "Hear that, Jill?" I said to the ring that still hung by the stove. "Little guy's got pipes." I heard my own voice echo off the planks, dry, unpracticed, but warmer than it had sounded in months. The second night was easier. The cub drank a full 2 milliliters at each feeding, barely a thimbleful, but it kept the fever from spiking. I dozed with my chair tipped against the wall, boots crossed on the planks, the box balanced on my lap so my body heat fed the blanket of warm air inside. Each time I drifted off, I dreamed in flickers, headlights on a highway, a hospital room too bright to be real, my wife's hand slipping from mine, dreams that usually left me gasping. But whenever I jolted awake, the kit was still breathing, and the panic fizzled into a shaky relief. By dawn of the second day its ears twitched at every creak of the cabin, and its paws, no bigger than thimbles, paddled at the sock whenever hunger woke it. I caught myself narrating the timetable like a flight controller, feeding in 3, 2, 1, and when the dropper emptied, copy that, kiddo, solid burn. Crazy, maybe, but the tinny bravado kept the fear from seeping back in. Late that afternoon, as snow started sifting from a whitewashed sky, I laid the kid in the crook of my arm and settled on the rocker beside the window. Outside, twilight deepened into blue steel. The forest held its breath. Then a shape unlatched itself from the shadows and trotted into the clearing. The vixen. She didn't approach the porch this time. Instead she sat on her haunches beneath the window, perfectly still, tail wrapped around her toes, muzzle lifted as if testing the air that leaked from the drafty sill. A single flake landed on her ear, she didn't shake it off. Headlights of amber caught the dim cabin glow, and held. I drew the blanket tighter around the kit and leaned closer to the pane. We locked eyes through a crust of frost so thin it looked like old glass. "I'm doing my best," I murmured. My breath fogged the view, then cleared. She didn't blink. Didn't whine. Just waited, a silent witness to the strange alliance she herself had brokered. I sat with him in my arms and saw her, the fox, sit there, silent, waiting. It was more than trust. It was dignity. Minutes stretched. My legs prickled, but I couldn't move. Breaking the moment felt like stepping on sacred ground. The kit stirred, emitting a squeak no louder than a sneaker on linoleum. The vixen's ears snapped forward. For an instant her whole body leaned toward the window, as though the glass might dissolve if she willed it. Then, decision made, she laid her head on her paws and closed her eyes. Snow thickened around her shoulders, tracing furrows down her back, but she remained, a small, red sculpture paying homage to a life that now pulsed between my palms. Dusk collapsed into true night. I rose slowly, legs stiff, and laid the cub back in its box near the stove. When I checked the window again, the porch was empty, only wind-carved drifts hinted she'd been there at all. I told myself it made sense, a wild animal satisfied the cub was safe, returning to her own. I thought she'd come to say goodbye. But that was only the beginning. 3 days after the night she kept vigil, I woke to a hush so complete it felt padded, as if the world had wrapped itself in quilts. Dawn filtered pale gold between the pines. The kit, stronger now, belly round with milk, snoozed in the crockbox beside the stove. I cracked the door to check the thermometer tacked outside and stopped cold. The vixen was on the porch. Not just near it, on it. Front paws planted on the warped plank that marked the threshold, claws hooked into a splintered groove only inches from the jamb. Her breath rose in faint clouds, steady as a pendulum. One step farther and her muzzle would cross into my world. I eased the door wide. Boards groaned. She flinched but didn't retreat. Instead she fixed on the bundle in my arms, brown eyes soft, unblinking. I felt the tremor in her ribcage before I could hear it, a low, thrumming whine so fragile it might have been the hinge of my own heart. I knelt, knees popping, and presented the kit like an offering. Its tiny ears flicked, it peeped once, recognizing the cold. The vixen stretched her neck forward, every vertebra visible beneath the winter coat, and touched her nose to the cub's. The contact was feather-light, a brush of whiskers and the whisper of fur. She breathed in. Breathed out. No panic. Just a measured, almost ceremonial exchange of scent. Instinct screamed to keep hands clear, but grief's louder twin, gratitude, held me still. I felt her breath on my knuckles, warm, even, carrying the musk of leaf mold, winter grass, the untamed hours between dusk and dawn. I felt her breath, warm, steady, and knew, she wasn't wild. She was real. The kit chirruped, tiny tongue flicking at her nose. She answered with a chuff, something between a sigh and a lullaby, then stepped back, but only one pace. Her gaze slid from the cub to me, as if comparing heartbeats she couldn't see. I lifted my free hand, palm up. She studied the lines like a fortune teller, then pressed her muzzle into the cup of flesh and held it there, eyes half-lidded. My throat locked. I could smell pine tar on my coat, the smoke from last night's fire, but her scent braided through it, iron and berries and something sharp as early stars. I wanted Jill to see this, wanted the laugh that would have burst from her, that bright, I told you nature never gives up on us, grin. Snow sighed off the eaves. The fox straightened. One last look, a silent benediction, and she ghosted down the steps, trotting toward the tree lean where shadows still lingered. Sunlight speared through fir branches and gilded her coat until she looked forged in copper. False ending, I watched until she vanished and told myself that was the climax, proof of trust complete, story concluded. But epilogues aren't written by men, they're written by the woods. From that morning on she came every dusk, punctual as a metronome. Never crossed the sill again, but settled on the porch rail like a sentry, ears swept forward, tail draped over her paws. Sometimes she stayed 10 minutes, sometimes an hour. She never asked for food. She never tried to reclaim the cub. She simply watched him grow. And grow he did. 2 weeks out he hit 2 full ounces, heavy enough that my forearm tingled after feedings. His eyes cracked open, first one cloudy slit, then the other, turquoise fading to ocean amber. The first thing those eyes focused on was the beam of my flashlight, the second was my face. I felt something unclench, a knot I'd carried since the oncology ward, when his gaze anchored to mine. Mornings began with a ritual: stoke the fire, heat milk, stir in vitamins. I'd lift the kit, by now I called him Rust for the penny shine of his coat, and recite the day's agenda as if chairing a board meeting: 1/4 inch of walking practice, 2 droppers of formula, and, if you're up for it, a safety inspection of the front yard. He'd squeak, I'd pretend that was assent. We were ridiculous, and we were alive. One afternoon I found the old cedar feeder Jill had hung years earlier, warped, roof caved in, nothing a handful of deck screws and glue couldn't fix. I set Rust on a folded blanket at the workbench and chattered while the drill whined. He tracked the bit, head tilting like a curious pup, paws needing air. By sunset the feeder hung again, bright with new sealant. Chickadees arrived the next dawn, gossiping in Morse code. Their wings glinted silver in the low light, and for the first time since burying Jill I realized I was humming some old Springsteen track, off-key and grinning. Evenings belonged to the porch. I brought Rust out bundled in my jacket. The vixen always appeared within minutes, materializing at the edge of the yard like a thought taking shape. She kept her distance but never missed a milestone: the first wobble to all fours, the first unsteady hop, the first triumphant bark that startled him so much he toppled sideways. Each success pried another splinter out of my chest. He looked at me like my son once had, warm and bewildered, except in those animal eyes was an entire world. Some nights, after Rust fell asleep tucked against my collarbone, I'd whisper to the fox across the snow. "He's gaining weight," I reported. "Stools solid, temperatures stable." She'd flick an ear, as if noting it in a ledger. One evening I confessed, "I'm scared for the day you take him back." Her head cocked, soft silhouette against the drifts, and for a breath I imagined she'd answer in my wife's voice, "That's how you know you're still living, love." Work, to which I'd been numb, started to matter again. I cleared blown-down branches from the trail behind the cabin, reshingled the leaky eaves, sanded the porch rail where the fox perched so she wouldn't catch a splinter. With each completed chore I said aloud, "You're still alive." And needed. The phrase became a pulse, sinking to the hammer strikes and saw strokes. Rust's world expanded by inches, first the cabin floorboards, tail chasing under the table, then the footprint of sunlight on the porch, then 5 tentative steps onto real snow, paws lifting high at the strange cold. He whined once, I scooped him up. The vixen, wading deeper in the yard, twitched but held. I knelt so mother and child could sniff hello. They touched noses. She withdrew, not ready, but her eyes softened with approval. I told myself this equilibrium might stretch forever: fox in the yard, kid on my lap, man between 2 versions of himself. But nature writes in arcs, not straight lines, and the horizon was already bending toward a handoff I couldn't yet face. False ending. I lay awake that night, Kit curled behind my knees, convinced I'd reached the summit, nothing left but the long easy trail down. The wind outside answered with a low, hollow laugh that shook the shutters. A reminder: mountains never level out, they simply hide the next climb in mist. February nights fall like trapdoors, one moment twilight, the next a black so thick even moonlight seems to drown. Rust was 6 weeks old, bright-eyed and reckless, already darting across the porch on stubby legs while I hovered like an anxious crossing guard. I just slipped him an evening feed when a sound knifed through the hush, low, ragged, unmistakably predatory. A growl. My flashlight beam sliced the yard. 10 yards out, a huge fox, scarred muzzle, shoulders broad as a coyote's, paced a tight semicircle, jaws working, amber eyes locked on Rust. The kit froze, every hair standing. Before I could scoop him up, a russet streak rocketed from the tree lean. His mother. She planted herself between the male and the porch, hackles saw-toothed, tail fanned wide. The male lunged, she met him with a roar I felt in my sternum. They whirled, teeth flashing, snow erupting under their paws. Twice he feinted left, seeking an opening. Twice she blocked, snapping so close I saw saliva arc in the flashlight beam. Rust whimpered behind my boot. I inched forward, useless except for the piece of cordwood I'd snatched as a club. The male eyed me, gauging risk, then lunged a third time, straight for the kit. The vixen leapt, body a live fuse, and slammed her shoulder into his chest. They hit the ground in a tangle, her jaws clamped on his ear. He yelped, twisted free, and bolted toward the pines, blood stippling the snow. She didn't pursue. She turned instead, slowly, deliberately, to Rust. 1 step. 2. She nudged him with her nose, checked each paw, then lifted her head to me. I saw her defend not just a child, but her choice, her trust in me. That was worth more than I could ever repay. My throat burned, whether from cold air or held back tears I couldn't tell. I knelt, set the cordwood aside, and stroked Rust's trembling spine. The vixen watched a beat longer, flanks pulsing, then padded to the tree lean where darkness swallowed her flame-bright coat. Inside, I paced until dawn, the scene replaying in cruel detail, the male's teeth, the snow spray, her body shielding the kit like living armor. I'd thought trust was a quiet thing, shared glances on moonlit nights. Now I knew it had claws. False ending, by sunrise I convinced myself the danger was past. She had proven her resolve, chased the threat away. But the forest was only tightening the bowstring for the next shot. Spring seeped into the timber by stealth, first a drip from the eaves, then the green mist of alder buds. Rust traded downy fluff for sleek guard hairs the color of new pennies. He discovered speed, mock-pouncing beetles and pitching sideways in athletic tumbles. Each dusk the vixen arrived, but now she kept farther back, letting him test his legs between us. Some instinct told her, and me, he needed distance to grow. Weeks passed. His visits thinned, nightly became every other evening, then twice a week. The first time he stayed away 3 sunsets in a row I paced like a man awaiting biopsy results. On the 4th, he burst from the ferns, gangly and radiant, a vole dangling from his jaws. He dropped it at my feet, tail whirring, a clumsy, perfect gift. Pride swallowed my worry. I tousled his ears, he nipped my sleeve and dashed off into the gloaming where his mother stood waiting. She didn't look at him. She looked at me, and in that glance I understood, the handoff had begun. One humid morning in May I caught my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror and had to lean closer. The man staring back wasn't the hunched ghost who'd fled the city. Shoulders squared. Eyes clear. Beard trimmed, mostly. My pulse didn't pound with grief's white noise, it drummed a steadier rhythm, purpose. I laughed, an actual bark of sound that echoed off the tiles. You're still alive. And needed. The mantra had settled into my bones. I patched the cabin porch, replaced the rusted screen door, even planted a row of beans where snowdrifts once piled. Work songs slipped out unbidden, sometimes Johnny Cash, sometimes Jill's favorite Otis Redding tune. I sang to the trees, to the chickadees, to the empty road. And sometimes, on lucky nights, to Rust, who'd appear just long enough to yip back before vanishing after his mother. One twilight he lingered longer, perched on the feeder post while the vixen waited at the yard's edge. He scanned the clearing, then my face, as if committing both to memory. Moonlight silvered his whiskers. I knew without words this was the threshold, child turning wanderer, tether thinning to a single, brittle thread. He bounded away. The vixen followed but paused, casting one last look at the cabin, at me. Not a farewell, something quieter, like a period at the end of a sentence perfectly spoken. Then she slipped into the fern gloom. I thought that was that, story over, circle closed, no encore. But I'd forgotten the woods keep rituals we know nothing about. The calendar said October again, the very day the vixen first tapped on my life. A razor of frost glazed the porch boards, crunching beneath my boots as I stepped outside to split the evening's firewood. The air tasted electric, like distant lightning with no storm in sight. I had just set the maul against the chopping block when it happened, tap tap tap, that precise rhythm of pause I hadn't heard in months. It drifted from the darkness beyond the feeder, soft but certain, the way a knuckle raps when the visitor already knows the door will open. My pulse stuttered. I followed the sound to the edge of the cabin's glow, lantern in one hand, breath in the other. And there, caught in the weak light, stood two foxes. The first I recognized instantly, the vixen, her coat burnished by a year's worth of seasons, eyes calm as banked embers. Beside her rose a taller shape, shoulders broad, muzzle framed by the faintest ruff. Rust. Grown sleek and sure, no trace of the trembling bundle I'd nursed beneath a wool sock. His eyes, once turquoise, then amber, now mirrored the full autumn moon. Neither moved. They simply watched me, as if weighing an invitation only I could give. I swallowed, set the lantern on a stump, and took one slow step forward. The beam slid across frost-whitened grass, painting it gold. Rust answered first. He trotted ahead, every stride both cautious and eager, stopping at the foot of the porch. The vixen matched him, flank to flank, the way river currents braid but never clash. He lowered his head. Something dangled from his jaws, a snow-white rabbit, limp, its fur unmarked. He climbed the single step, yes, the porch he had once conquered in wide-eyed hops, and laid the rabbit on the threshold. Then he sat, tail curled over his toes, gaze lifted to mine. Time warped. I could hear my heartbeat thudding against pine trunks, feel heat bloom behind my eyes. This was no meal. This was a gift, an offering across worlds. The vixen settled beside her son. For a full minute, maybe 5, we shared a silence too alive to shatter. My breath plumed in slow spirals, theirs drifted like twin wisps, steady, synchronized. No bark, no chirr, just presence. The porch lamp hummed. Somewhere, far off, an owl questioned the night, but the sound felt outside the circle we'd drawn around ourselves. I knelt. My fingers brushed the rabbit's fur, still warm, still pliant. The weight of it landed on my palms and on my chest all at once. Rust's ears flicked forward, awaiting judgment. The vixen's gaze softened into something I can only call mercy. "Thank you," I whispered, the words cracking like thin ice. My throat refused to clear. Thank you." Rust stood, stretched, and touched his nose to the back of my gloved hand, once, firm enough to feel the damp of his breath, the ghost of his childhood fever. Then he turned. The vixen rose with him. Together they padded down the step, crossed the yard, and paused at the tree line. Rust glanced back exactly once, his mother did not. In 2 beats they slipped into the black pines and were gone, the hush knitting shut behind them. Only then did the cold land like a wave. I sank onto the porch, rabbit cradle to my chest, lungs locked tight around an impossible truth. I held their gift in my hands, and I couldn't breathe. This couldn't have happened. But I saw it with my own eyes. If your heart just skipped a beat, you understand. Subscribe. Here we remember the truths we've forgotten. Nature speaks, softly but clearly. If you, too, believe animals are capable of more than we are, right, wild ones remember kindness. Now I know it for certain.